The wind cut through Adelaide Harper's worn cotton dress like 1,000 frozen knives as she stood on the corner of Main Street in Coolidge, Arizona. Her fingers so numb she could barely feel the delicate stems of the white roses she clutched in her basket. December of 1883 had brought an unexpected cold snap to the small desert town, and while folks from back east might have laughed at Arizonans complaining about temperatures hovering just above freezing, Adelaide had never known such bitter cold in all her 19 years. Her breath came out in small clouds of vapor, and she stamped her feet against the hard, packed earth, trying to coax some feeling back into her toes through the thin leather of her boots. The soles had worn through months ago, and she had stuffed them with newspaper, but the cold still seeped in relentlessly. She had been standing on this corner since dawn, watching the sun climb reluctantly into a gray sky that promised no warmth. The flowers in her basket had come from the small greenhouse her late mother had built behind their modest house on the edge of town, the only thing of value her mother had left her besides a mountain of debt to the bank. Adelaide had tended those plants with desperate care, nursing them through the unexpected freeze, keeping a small fire burning night and day to protect them from the frost. These roses represented her last chance to make enough money to pay this month's interest to Mr. Caldwell at the bank, who had made it abundantly clear that his patience was wearing thin. The streets of Coolidge were quieter than usual, with most sensible people staying indoors near their stoves and fireplaces. A few bundled figures hurried past, heads down against the wind, barely sparing her a glance. Adelaide called out softly, offering her flowers, but her voice seemed to vanish in the cold air. Her lips had started to crack, and she could feel the sting of windburn on her cheeks. Still, she remained, because what choice did she have? The bank payment was due tomorrow, and if she did not make it, she would lose the house, the greenhouse, everything her mother had worked so hard to build. A wagon rattled past, the driver huddled under a heavy coat, not even looking her way. Adelaide fought back the tears that threatened to freeze on her lashes. She had sold only 2 small bouquets all morning, earning barely enough to buy a loaf of bread. The rest of the flowers would wilt soon if she did not sell them, and then she would have nothing at all. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up, and she saw a lone rider approaching from the south end of town. Even from a distance, she could tell he was a cowboy, sitting tall in the saddle despite the cold, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. His horse was a magnificent bay gelding, steam rising from its nostrils in the frigid air. As he drew closer, Adelaide straightened, lifting her basket hopefully, though she expected him to ride past like all the others. But he did not ride past. Instead, he reined in his horse directly in front of her, and she found herself looking up into a face that was all hard angles and weathered bronze skin, with eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with a few days' worth of dark stubble on his jaw and a serious set to his mouth. His coat was good-quality sheepskin, worn but well-maintained, and she could see the handle of a Colt revolver at his hip. How much for all of them? His voice was deep and rough, like gravel underfoot, but not unkind. Adelaide blinked, certain she had misheard. "I am sorry, what? All of them? Every flower in that basket, how much?" She looked down at the roses, then back up at him, her mind struggling to work through the fog of cold and exhaustion. There were at least 3 dozen roses left, carefully wrapped in brown paper to protect them from the wind. "I am selling them for 10 cents each, sir, but if you want them all, I could make it. $8 for everything." He reached into his coat without hesitation and pulled out a leather purse, counting out bills with gloved fingers. When he leaned down from his saddle to hand her the money, She saw that he had given her $10, not 8. "Sir, this is too much," she protested. But he was already taking the basket from her numb hands, setting it carefully across his saddle. "Go home," he said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. "It is too cold for you to be out here. Go home and get warm." Before she could respond, before she could even thank him properly, he had touched the brim of his hat in a brief salute and nudged his horse forward, riding down Main Street with her basket of white roses balanced before him. Adelaide stood frozen to the spot, clutching the $10 in her stiff fingers, watching him disappear around the corner by the general store. It took her several long moments to gather her wits enough to move. When she finally did, her feet were clumsy and uncoordinated from the cold, and she nearly stumbled. But the money was real in her hand, real enough to pay the bank and have enough left over for firewood and food. Real enough that she would not lose her home, at least not this month. The walk back to her small house seemed shorter than usual, though perhaps that was only because her mind was elsewhere, still seeing those whiskey-colored eyes and hearing that rough voice telling her to go home, to get warm. There had been something in his tone, something beyond simple kindness to a stranger. It had sounded almost like concern, as if the sight of her standing there in the cold had troubled him. Adelaide let herself into the house, which was barely warmer than outside since she had let the fire die down to save wood. She quickly built it back up, feeding precious kindling and logs into the stove, until heat began to radiate through the small front room. Only when she could feel her fingers again did she allow herself to sink into her mother's old rocking chair and count the money properly. $10. More than enough. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe without the weight of panic pressing on her chest. But as she sat there warming herself, her thoughts kept drifting back to the cowboy. Who was he? She had lived in Coolidge all her life and knew most everyone, at least by sight, but she had never seen him before. Where had he come from, and why had he bought all her flowers? What would a lone cowboy want with 3 dozen white roses? The questions circled in her mind like restless birds, finding no place to land. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with her, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from too many sleepless nights and too much worry. She dozed in the chair, her dreams full of whiskey-colored eyes and the sound of a deep voice cutting through the wind. When she woke, the winter sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too warm for such a cold day. Adelaide stirred the fire and made herself a simple supper of beans and cornbread, luxuries she could now afford thanks to her mysterious benefactor. As she ate, she made plans. Tomorrow she would go to the bank first thing and make her payment. Then she would go to the general store and inquire about the cowboy. Someone had to know who he was. That night, she slept better than she had in months, wrapped in every blanket she owned, with the stove burning steadily, and the knowledge that her home was safe for at least another month. Morning came with a pale sun that offered light but little warmth. Adelaide dressed in her best dress, a simple brown wool that her mother had made for her 3 years ago. It was patched in several places and the hem had been let down twice as she had grown, but it was clean and respectable. She pinned her dark blonde hair up carefully, trying to tame the curls that always seemed to have a mind of their own, and put on her threadbare coat. The bank was on the corner of First Street in Maine, a squat adobe building that always seemed to loom larger than its actual size. Adelaide squared her shoulders and walked through the door, the little bell jingling overhead. Mr. Caldwell looked up from his desk, his thin face arranging itself into an expression of false courtesy. "Miss Harper, I was just thinking about you. Tomorrow is the deadline for your payment." "I know, Mr. Caldwell. That is why I am here." She placed $8 on his desk, keeping the remaining 2 for necessities. "This month's interest as agreed." His eyebrows rose slightly, and she took satisfaction in his surprise. He had expected her to fail, she realized. He had wanted her to fail so he could claim her property. The greenhouse lot would be valuable to the right buyer. "Well," he said, making a show of counting the money slowly, "I suppose that buys you another month. But, Miss Harper, we both know this cannot go on forever. A young woman like you, alone, trying to run a business. It is not natural. You should find yourself a husband, someone to take care of these matters for you." Adelaide bit back the sharp response that rose to her lips. Instead, she said sweetly, "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Caldwell. I will keep that in mind. Good day." She left before he could say anything else, her hands trembling not with cold but with suppressed anger. Find a husband, as if men were lining up to marry a penniless flower girl with no prospects and a property mortgaged to the hilt. As if marriage were the solution to every problem a woman might face. Her mood was dark as she walked to the general store, but it lifted slightly when she pushed through the door and was greeted by the warm smile of Mrs. Patterson, the owner's wife. "Adelaide, how wonderful to see you, dear. We heard you were out selling flowers yesterday in that dreadful cold. You should not take such risks with your health." "I had little choice, Mrs. Patterson, but it worked out well. A cowboy bought all my flowers." "Did he now?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes lit up with interest. "What did this cowboy look like?" Adelaide described him as best she could, the tall frame, the dark hair, the whiskey-colored eyes, the bay horse. As she spoke, recognition dawned on Mrs. Patterson's face. "That sounds like Xander Thornton," she said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "He rode in 2 days ago, took a room at the boarding house. Mrs. Riley says he is looking to buy property in the area, wants to start a ranch. Comes from Texas originally, she thinks, though he is not much for talking about himself. Xander Thornton." Now the cowboy had a name, and somehow that made him more real, less like a figure from a dream. "Do you know why he would want so many flowers?" Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "No idea, dear. Perhaps he has a sweetheart somewhere, though if he does, she is not in Coolidge. He has been keeping to himself mostly, asking questions about land prices and water rights." Adelaide thanked her and left the store, her mind churning with this new information. Xander Thornton, a rancher from Texas looking to settle in Arizona. It made sense in a way. Coolidge was growing, with the railroad rumored to be coming through in the next few years. Good grazing land could still be had for reasonable prices if you knew where to look, but it did not explain the flowers. She spent the rest of the day tending her greenhouse, coaxing life from the plants that remained. The cold snap had damaged some of her stock, but most had survived, and new buds were already forming. She worked until her back ached and her hands were stained green, losing herself in the familiar rhythms of the work. Her mother had taught her everything about growing things, had passed on a love of the earth and its gifts that went bone deep. As evening approached, Adelaide found herself walking into town again, drawn by a restlessness she could not name. She told herself she needed to stretch her legs, needed some air after being in the greenhouse all day. But her feet carried her down Main Street, past the bank and the general store, to the boarding house where Mrs. Riley rented rooms to travelers and newcomers. She stood across the street, feeling foolish, wondering what she was doing. She could not just knock on the door and ask for him. What would she say? "Thank you for the flowers. Why did you buy them all? Do you have a sweetheart back in Texas?" As she stood there arguing with herself, the door opened and Xander Thornton stepped out. He was dressed much as he had been the day before, the sheepskin coat and worn denim trousers, the hat pulled low. He did not see her at first. His attention focused on adjusting his gloves, and she had a moment to study him properly. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the lean, hard build of a man who had spent his life working outdoors. His face was handsome in a rough-hewn way, all strong bones and sharp angles, with a mouth that looked like it did not smile often. There was a weariness about him, she thought, a shadow in those unusual eyes that spoke of sorrows carried and hardships endured. Then he looked up and saw her, and their eyes met across the dusty street. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he stepped off the porch and walked toward her with long, purposeful strides. Adelaide's heart began to pound in a way that was entirely inappropriate. They were strangers. He had done her a kindness, nothing more. There was no reason for her pulse to race or her breath to quicken. "Miss Harper," he said when he reached her, and she realized with a start that he knew her name. "Mr. Thornton," she replied, and watched surprise flicker across his face that she knew his in turn. "Small town," he said, a hint of something that might have been amusement in his voice. "Very small. I wanted to thank you properly for yesterday, what you did. You saved me, truly. I was about to lose my home." His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I am glad I could help. You should not have been out there in that cold. It was not safe. I had no choice. I have debts to pay, and the flowers were all I had to sell." He was quiet for a moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she held his gaze. Finally, he said, "Are you busy right now? I was about to get some supper at the hotel dining room. Would you join me?" The invitation caught her off guard. Proper young women did not dine alone with men they barely knew, especially not at night. But Adelaide had long since stopped caring much about propriety. Propriety did not pay the bank, did not keep her warm or fed. And besides, she found she very much wanted to accept. "I would like that," she said. They walked together to the hotel, the finest building in Coolidge with its 2 stories and glass windows. The dining room was warm and well lit, with white tablecloths and real china. Adelaide could not remember the last time she had eaten in such a place. Xander pulled out a chair for her with an old-fashioned courtesy that spoke of good upbringing, then sat across from her. The waitress came and took their orders. Xander asked for steak and potatoes, and Adelaide chose the chicken, acutely aware of how much everything cost. But when she tried to order just the soup to save him money, he fixed her with a look and said, "Order what you want, not what you think you should." So she ordered the chicken, and when it came, it was the best meal she had eaten in months, tender and savory, with vegetables that had been cooked just right. They ate in silence at first, the comfortable kind that did not need filling with chatter. But gradually, they began to talk. He told her about Texas, about growing up on a ranch near San Antonio, about losing his parents to fever when he was 20. He told her about working for other men, saving every penny, learning the business from the ground up. He did not mention why he had left Texas, and she did not press, sensing that whatever pain lay behind that decision was still too raw to probe. She told him about her mother, about learning to grow flowers in the harsh Arizona desert, about fighting to keep the business going after her mother's death 6 months ago. She told him about the debt, about Mr. Caldwell and his barely concealed eagerness to foreclose. She did not tell him about the nights she had cried herself to sleep, terrified and alone, or the times she had gone hungry to save money for plant food and seeds. Some things were too personal to share with a stranger, no matter how kind his eyes. "You asked me yesterday why I bought all your flowers," he said as they finished their meal. "The truth is, I saw you standing there and you looked like you were about to freeze to death. Your lips were blue. I could not just ride past and do nothing. But 3 dozen roses." "What did you do with them all?" He looked almost embarrassed, a faint color rising in his cheeks. "I took them to the cemetery. There are a lot of graves there, old ones that nobody tends anymore. I put a few roses on each one. Figured everyone deserves flowers on their grave, even if they have no family left to remember them." Adelaide felt something crack open in her chest, some hard shell she had built around her heart. She had expected him to say he had a sweetheart, or that he had given them to the ladies at church, or even that he had simply thrown them away. But this act of kindness to the forgotten dead, struck her as one of the most beautiful things she had ever heard. That is. She began, but her voice caught. She swallowed hard and tried again. "That is a wonderful thing to have done," he shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. It seemed right. They talked for another hour until the dining room was nearly empty and the waitress was giving them pointed looks. When they finally left, stepping out into the cold night air, Xander offered to walk her home. She accepted, and they made their way through the quiet streets together, their breath forming clouds in the lamplight. At her door, he paused, his hat in his hands. "Would it be all right if I called on you again? Properly, I mean, if you are not already spoken for." "I am not spoken for," she said, her heart doing strange acrobatics in her chest. "And yes, you may call on me. I would like that very much." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. "Good night, Adelaide." "Good night, Xander." She went inside and leaned against the door, breathing hard, feeling like she had just run a great distance. It was too fast, too sudden. She barely knew him. But somehow, in the space of 2 days, Xander Thornton had become important to her in a way she could not quite explain or understand. The next day, he came to her greenhouse in the afternoon, asking if she would show him how she grew roses in the desert. She walked him through the rows of plants, explaining about temperature and water, about protecting tender blooms from the harsh sun and the occasional freeze. He listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, and she found herself relaxing in his presence, the conversation flowing easily. "You love this," he observed, watching her prune a rosebush with careful precision. "I do. My mother used to say that growing things was a kind of magic, making beauty out of dirt and water and sunlight. I think she was right." "My mother loved flowers too," he said quietly. "She had a garden at the ranch, roses and honeysuckle and sweet peas. After she died, I could not bear to go near it. My father let it all die. I am sorry, losing a parent is. There are no words for it. No, there are not." They stood together in the warm greenhouse, surrounded by the green scent of growing things, and Adelaide felt the connection between them deepen. He understood loss the way she did, carried the same weight of grief and responsibility. Over the following weeks, Xander became a constant presence in her life. He came to the greenhouse almost every day, helping her with the heavy work, repairing the glass panes that had cracked in the cold, building her a new potting bench from scrap lumber. He took her to dinner twice more, and they went to church together on Sunday, ignoring the curious stares and whispered speculation of the town. He told her more about his plans for a ranch. He had found a piece of property about 5 miles out of town, good grassland with a reliable creek running through it. The owner was willing to sell for a fair price, and Xander had almost enough saved to make the purchase. He talked about building a house, starting with cattle and eventually breeding horses, his voice taking on a passion she recognized from her own feelings about flowers. Adelaide found herself drawn into his dreams, imagining what such a ranch might look like, offering suggestions about where to plant windbreaks and where a garden might thrive. It felt natural, this shared planning, as if they were building something together even though nothing had been said about a future beyond these casual conversations. But there was nothing casual about the way he looked at her, or the way her heart raced when he was near. Nothing casual about the way their hands would brush when they worked side by side, or the way his eyes would linger on her face when he thought she was not watching. One evening in early January, after the worst of the cold had passed and the desert was warming again, Xander took her out to see his land. They rode together, Adelaide perched behind him on his bay gelding, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. The solid warmth of him beneath her hands made her dizzy in a way that had nothing to do with the motion of the horse. The property was beautiful in the way of the Arizona desert, all vast spaces and endless sky, with the mountains purple in the distance and the creek singing over smooth stones. Xander helped her down from the horse and walked her around, pointing out boundaries and explaining his plans. Here would be the house, there the barn, over there the corrals. What do you think? He asked, and there was something vulnerable in his voice, as if her opinion mattered more than it should. I think it will be a wonderful ranch, she said honestly. I think you will build something good here. He turned to face her, and the setting sun caught in his eyes, turning them to liquid gold. Adelaide, I need to tell you something, her breath caught. All right. When I rode into Coolidge a month ago, I was not looking for anything except land and a fresh start. I had left Texas because there were too many memories there, too much pain. I thought I would buy my ranch and spend my life alone, working the land, and that would be enough. And then I saw you standing on that corner, freezing to death, too stubborn or too desperate to go inside where it was warm. And something changed. He took a step closer, and she could feel the heat radiating from him in the cooling evening air. I have not been able to stop thinking about you. You are strong and brave and beautiful, and you love growing things the way I love this land. I know it has not been long, and I know I should probably wait longer before saying this, but I am not a patient man. I am falling in love with you, Adelaide Harper, and I wanted you to know. The words hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying and wonderful. Adelaide's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts tumbling over each other. It was too fast, too soon. They barely knew each other. She should be cautious, sensible, protect her heart, but her heart had already decided. It had decided on that frozen December morning when he had told her to go home and get warm. It had decided in all the moments since, in every conversation and shared smile, in the way he made her feel safe and valued and seen. I am falling in love with you too, she said, and watched joy transform his face. He kissed her then, softly at first, his lips warm against hers, and then with growing intensity as she responded, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, his arms wrapping around her to pull her close. The kiss was everything a first kiss should be, sweet and passionate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Adelaide felt like the world had shifted on its axis, rearranging itself into a new and better configuration. Marry me, Xander said, his forehead resting against hers. I know I am asking too much too soon, but marry me anyway. We will build this ranch together. You can have your greenhouse as big as you want it. We will make a life here, you and me. Say yes. Adelaide laughed, dizzy with happiness. You are right. It is too soon and you are asking too much. Yes. Yes, I will marry you. They rode back to town in the gathering darkness, Adelaide's arms wrapped tight around Xander's waist, her cheek pressed against his back, feeling his heart beat strong and steady through the fabric of his coat. When he left her at her door, he kissed her again, lingering, reluctant to let her go. Soon, he promised. We will be married soon. The next weeks passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Xander finalized the purchase of his land and began building the house, working from dawn to dusk with the help of some men he hired from town. Adelaide continued tending her greenhouse, but now her work had new meaning. She was growing plants not just to survive, but to build something permanent, something she and Xander would share. They decided on a simple wedding at the church, just the minister and a few friends as witnesses. Adelaide had no family left, and Xander's were all dead or back in Texas. They would be each other's family now, and that was enough. She made herself a dress from white cotton she bought at the general store, sitting up late at night sewing by lamplight. It was not fancy, but it was pretty, with a fitted bodice and full skirt, and when she tried it on, she felt like a bride. The night before the wedding, Mrs. Patterson came to visit, bringing a veil that had been her grandmother's and a bouquet of white roses that Adelaide herself had grown. "Every bride should have something old and something new," she said, hugging Adelaide tight. "I am so happy for you, dear. That Xander Thornton is a good man. You can see it in his eyes." "I know," Adelaide said, her voice thick with emotion. "I am very lucky." "You both are, Mrs. Patterson corrected gently. "Love is always luck, but it is also work. Remember that when times get hard." They were married on a sunny February morning in 1884, with the light streaming through the church windows and falling in golden bars across the floor. Adelaide walked down the aisle alone, carrying her white roses, and found Xander waiting for her at the altar in a new suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes shining with tears he did not bother to hide. The ceremony was simple and brief, but when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Xander kissed her, Adelaide felt the weight of her loneliness and fear fall away, replaced by something solid and real and lasting. This was not a fairy tale. Their life together would have hardships and struggles, but they would face them together, and that made all the difference. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, in a room with clean white sheets and a window that looked out over Main Street. Xander was gentle with her, patient, making sure she felt safe and cherished. Afterward, they lay tangled together, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "I will love you until the day I die, Adelaide Thornton." "And I love you," she whispered back, tasting the newness of her married name, savoring it. "Always." The next morning, they loaded Adelaide's belongings into a wagon Xander had borrowed and drove out to the ranch. The house was small but sturdy, built from adobe bricks with a solid roof and real glass in the windows. It had 2 rooms, one for living and cooking, one for sleeping, with a loft above that could be finished later. Behind the house, Xander had built her a greenhouse larger than her old one with space for twice as many plants. "It is perfect," Adelaide said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Everything is perfect." They spent that first day settling in, unpacking Adelaide's few possessions, hanging her mother's old quilt on the wall of the bedroom, arranging furniture and making the house feel like home. That evening they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over their land, the sky turning colors that seemed too vivid to be real. "What are you thinking about?" Adelaide asked, lacing her fingers through his. "I am thinking about how different my life is now compared to a month ago. I am thinking about how glad I am that I rode into Coolidge when I did. I am thinking about how I want to spend the rest of my life right here with you." She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling utterly content. "That is exactly what I was thinking." The months that followed were hard work, but good. Xander started building his herd, buying cattle from neighboring ranches, hiring a few hands to help with the work. Adelaide tended her greenhouse and started a garden behind the house, growing vegetables as well as flowers. She sold her roses in town twice a week, making enough money to help with expenses and save a little besides. They fell into a rhythm, a partnership that felt as natural as breathing. Xander would rise before dawn to see to the cattle, and Adelaide would wake to find coffee already made, waiting for her. She would work in her greenhouse through the morning, and he would come in at noon for a meal she had prepared. Evenings they spent together, talking and planning, sometimes reading aloud from books they borrowed from the lending library in town, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. There were challenges, of course. The desert was unforgiving, with its droughts and dust storms and occasional floods when the rains came hard. They lost cattle to illness and predators. There were days when money was tight and tempers frayed. But they worked through each problem together, learning to compromise, learning to lean on each other's strengths. In the summer, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant. She told Xander one evening when he came in from the range, dusty and tired. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and then a joy so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing, then set her down quickly, apologizing, worried he might hurt the baby. "We are going to be parents," he said wonderingly. "Adelaide, we are going to have a child. Are you happy?" she asked, though she could see the answer on his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it. I am. I cannot find the words. This is everything I never knew I wanted." The pregnancy was not easy. Adelaide suffered from terrible sickness in the early months, barely able to keep down food, and Xander hovered over her anxiously, trying to help in any way he could. As she grew larger, the heat of the Arizona summer became oppressive, and she spent most of her time in the house, trying to stay cool. But through it all, there was excitement and anticipation, the knowledge that their family was growing, that the life they had built together was bearing fruit in the most literal way. Xander finished the loft, turning it into a nursery. He built a cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until there were no rough edges, and Adelaide sewed blankets and tiny clothes, marveling at how small they were. Mrs. Patterson and some of the other women from town came to visit, bringing gifts and advice, and for the first time since her mother's death, Adelaide felt like she was part of a community, like she belonged. The baby came in February, almost exactly a year after Adelaide and Xander had married. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Adelaide thought she might die from the pain. But Xander stayed with her through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, whispering encouragement and love. When the baby finally came, a healthy boy with strong lungs and dark hair like his father's, Adelaide felt a rush of love so powerful it was almost frightening. "He is beautiful," Xander said, his voice choked with emotion as he held his son for the first time. "Adelaide, he is perfect." They named him Thomas, after Xander's father, and he became the center of their world. Adelaide had never imagined she could love anyone as much as she loved Xander, but Thomas expanded her heart in ways she had not known were possible. Watching Xander with their son, seeing the tenderness with which he held the baby, the wonder in his eyes as he studied Thomas's tiny fingers and toes, made her fall in love with her husband all over again. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Xander's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled rancher spread, and he began to get contracts to supply beef to the mining camps up north. The money was good, better than they had hoped, and they were able to pay off the mortgage on Adelaide's old property in town. They kept the greenhouse there, hiring a young woman to help Adelaide tend it, and the flower business expanded as well. By the time Thomas was 2, they had built an addition onto the house, adding a proper kitchen and 2 more bedrooms. Adelaide was pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do. Their second child was a girl they named Lily, after Adelaide's mother, and she had her mother's dark blonde curls and her father's whiskey-colored eyes. Life settled into a new rhythm with 2 children. The house was noisier, messier, filled with laughter and occasional tears, with toys scattered across the floor and laundry always hanging on the line. It was exhausting and wonderful, and more than Adelaide had ever dared to dream of back in those desperate days when she had stood freezing on the corner of Main Street, trying to sell flowers to survive. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Xander took Adelaide out to the spot where he had proposed, leaving the children with Mrs. Patterson for the evening. They sat together on a blanket, watching the sun set, sharing a bottle of wine he had brought from town. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Marrying me so quickly without really knowing me?" Adelaide turned to look at him, this man who had become her whole world, who had given her security and love, and a family she had never hoped to have. His face was more weathered now, lined from sun and wind and the hard work of ranching. There were a few threads of gray in his dark hair, but his eyes were the same, that warm, whiskey color that had caught her attention the very first time she saw him. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. That day you bought my flowers and told me to go home, you saved my life in more ways than one. You gave me everything, Xander. How could I ever regret that?" He pulled her close, kissing her temple. "You saved me too. I was so lost when I came here, so broken. You put me back together. You gave me a reason to build something, to hope for the future. I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I did not think that was possible." They stayed out until the stars came out, bright and clear in the desert sky, talking about their children and their plans for the ranch. About the greenhouse Adelaide wanted to build to grow more exotic plants, about maybe adding horses to their cattle operation. They talked about ordinary things and important things, and underneath it all was the deep contentment of 2 people who had found exactly where they belonged. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges. There was a drought one year that tested them severely, forcing Xander to sell part of his herd at a loss and leaving Adelaide's gardens withered and brown. But they endured, drawing on savings and stubbornness in equal measure. There was the year Thomas broke his arm falling from a tree, and the terrifying days when Lily came down with a fever that would not break, and Adelaide sat up night after night, bathing her daughter's burning skin and praying. But there were also triumphs. Thomas grew into a capable young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, and Lily showed her mother's gift for growing things, spending hours in the greenhouse learning about plants. Adelaide's flower business became famous throughout the territory, with people coming from as far away as Phoenix to buy her roses. Xander's ranch became one of the most successful in the area, known for the quality of its beef and the integrity of its owner. They had 2 more children, another boy and another girl, and the house expanded again to accommodate the growing family. The ranch required more hands, and eventually, Xander built a bunkhouse for the cowboys who worked for him. Adelaide hired more help for the greenhouse and started teaching local women about growing flowers, passing on her mother's knowledge. On their 10th anniversary, the railroad finally came through Coolidge, just as everyone had predicted, and the town began to grow rapidly. Main Street was paved and new buildings went up. The old adobe bank was replaced with a brick structure, and Mr. Caldwell, who had been so eager to foreclose on Adelaide's property, retired and moved back east. Adelaide saw him leave with no small amount of satisfaction. But for all the changes in town, the ranch remained a constant, a piece of land carved out of the desert through hard work and determination. Adelaide and Xander had built something lasting, something they could pass on to their children. And at the center of it all was their love, the unexpected blessing that had begun on a freezing December morning when a cowboy had seen a girl selling flowers and decided to help. Thomas was 18 when he fell in love with the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a spirited girl named Sarah who could ride as well as any man and was not afraid of hard work. Xander and Adelaide watched their son court her with all the intensity of first love, and they saw echoes of themselves in the young couple. When Thomas asked for their blessing to marry, they gave it gladly, and the wedding was held at the ranch, with half the territory in attendance. Seeing her son so happy, so settled, Adelaide felt the circle complete somehow. She thought about her mother, about the legacy that had been passed down through her, and she was grateful. Grateful for the greenhouse her mother had built, grateful for the skills she had learned, grateful that desperation had driven her to stand on that corner in the cold. Because without all of that, she never would have met Xander, never would have built this life. Lily married a few years later, a doctor who had come to Coolidge to open a practice. Their younger children were still at home, filling the house with noise and energy. Adelaide was in her 40s now, her blonde hair streaked with gray, her hands roughened by years of working in the soil. But she felt young when Xander looked at her, young and cherished and loved. They were sitting on the porch one evening, as they had done countless times over the years, watching the sun set over their land. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and smoke rose from the chimney of the bunkhouse where the ranch hands were having supper. From inside the house came the sound of their youngest children laughing, and Adelaide could hear the clatter of dishes as they helped clean up from dinner. "Do you remember that first day?" Xander asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "When I saw you selling flowers." "Every detail," Adelaide said. "I was so cold I could barely feel my hands. I was terrified I was going to lose everything. And then you rode up, and you looked at me with those eyes of yours, and I thought you were the most handsome man I had ever seen." He laughed, a warm rumble that still made her heart flutter after all these years. "I thought you were going to pass out from the cold. Your lips were blue. I could not just leave you there. I am glad you did not. I am glad you bought all those flowers and told me to go home. I am glad you put roses on the graves of strangers because it was the right thing to do. I am glad for every moment that brought us here." He reached over and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture that had become second nature over the years. "I rode into Coolidge looking for land and a fresh start. I found so much more than that. I found you. I found home." "We both did," Adelaide said softly. "We both found home." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and red, they sat together in the growing darkness, two people who had taken a chance on love and won everything. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities, full of the grandchildren who would come, and the continued growth of the ranch and the greenhouse. But in that moment, all that mattered was the present, the warmth of Xander's hand in hers, the sound of their children inside, the solid reality of the life they had built together. Years continued to unfold like the pages of a well-loved book. Thomas and Sarah had 3 children of their own, and they built a house on the far side of the ranch property, close enough to help with the work but far enough for their own space. Thomas took over more and more of the day-to-day operations of the ranch, and Xander began to slow down, spending more time with Adelaide and their younger children. Lily and her husband lived in town, where his medical practice thrived. She kept a greenhouse of her own, smaller than her mother's but filled with medicinal plants that she supplied to her husband. Adelaide loved visiting her there, seeing her daughter happy and fulfilled, carrying on the family tradition in her own way. Their youngest son, Daniel, showed no interest in ranching or flowers. Instead, he loved books and learning, and they sent him to school in Phoenix, supporting his dream of becoming a teacher. Their youngest daughter, Rose, was still at home, 16 and full of dreams of her own. Adelaide was 50 when Xander had his accident. He was out checking on cattle with Thomas when his horse spooked and threw him. He landed badly, breaking his leg in 2 places. The doctor came out from town and said it, but Xander was confined to bed rest for weeks, and the leg never healed quite right. Afterward, he walked with a limp, and there were some things he simply could not do anymore. It was a difficult adjustment for a man who had built his life on hard physical labor. Xander struggled with feeling useless, with watching his son do work that had always been his. Adelaide saw him wrestling with it, saw the frustration and occasional despair, and she did what she had always done. She loved him through it, reminded him that he was so much more than what he could do with his hands, that his value lay in his wisdom and experience and the family he had built. Slowly, he adapted. He took over the business side of the ranch, managing accounts and contracts, dealing with buyers and suppliers. He spent more time with their grandchildren, teaching them about the land and the cattle, passing on his knowledge. And in the evenings, he would sit with Adelaide in the greenhouse, watching her work, sometimes reading aloud to her as she tended her plants. "I think I might have been more scared during those weeks after your accident than I was when I was selling flowers in the cold," Adelaide admitted one evening. "The thought of losing you." "You are not getting rid of me that easily," Xander said, a smile tugging at his lips. "I plan to be around for a good long while yet, annoying you and getting underfoot." "Good," she said firmly. "Because I am not done with you. We have grandchildren to spoil and children to marry off and years ahead of us still." And there were years ahead, blessed years filled with the quiet joys of later life. They watched Rose marry a young rancher from a neighboring territory and move away, though she visited often, always bringing her children to stay for a few weeks each summer. Daniel became a teacher as he had dreamed, working in a school in Tucson, and his letters were full of stories about his students and his work. They celebrated their 25th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren, with a party at the ranch that seemed to include half of Arizona. Adelaide wore a new dress that Lily had made for her, deep blue that brought out her eyes, and Xander wore his best suit. They danced together in the barn, which had been cleared and decorated for the occasion, moving slowly because of Xander's leg but still moving, still together. 25 years, Xander said, pulling her close. "It feels like no time at all and like forever all at once." "I know exactly what you mean," Adelaide replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes I still see that young cowboy who bought all my flowers, and sometimes I look at you and see every year we have lived, every moment we have shared. I love you, Adelaide Thornton. I loved you when you were a desperate girl selling flowers in the cold. And I love you now, with your gray hair and your strong hands and your beautiful eyes. I will love you until I take my last breath, and if there is anything after, I will love you there too." She looked up at him, this man who had been her partner, her lover, her best friend, her whole world for 25 years. "And I love you, Xander. Thank you for seeing me that day. Thank you for telling me to go home and get warm. Thank you for all of it." They kissed there in the barn, surrounded by their family and friends, surrounded by the life they had built. And Adelaide felt the same flutter in her heart she had felt that very first time on his land when he had told her he was falling in love with her. The years rolled on, bringing the inevitable changes that time brings. Adelaide's hands grew more gnarled with arthritis, making it harder to work in the greenhouse, though she still spent time there every day, supervising and teaching the young women who worked for her. Xander's limp grew more pronounced, and there were days when the pain in his leg was bad enough that he stayed in bed. But they adapted, they endured, they continued. Their grandchildren grew and some of them married, bringing great-grandchildren into the world. The ranch continued to prosper under Thomas's management, and he expanded into horse breeding as his father had once dreamed of doing. Adelaide's greenhouse had become an institution in Coolidge, known throughout the Southwest, and she took quiet pride in that legacy. On their 30th anniversary, they took a trip back to town, to the corner of Main Street where they had first met. The town had changed beyond recognition. The dirt roads were paved, and there were automobiles now alongside horses and wagons. Electric lights had replaced oil lamps and the railroad station bustled with activity. But the corner was still there and they stood on it together, remembering. "I can still see you," Xander said softly. "Standing right here, so cold and scared and brave. Your basket of flowers, your blue lips. The way you looked at me when I asked to buy them all. I thought you were crazy," Adelaide admitted with a laugh, "or that I was dreaming. I could not believe my luck." "Luck for both of us," Xander said. He pulled something from his pocket, and Adelaide saw with surprise that it was a single white rose carefully wrapped. "I thought we should mark the occasion properly." "Where did you get that?" "I have my ways." "Will you accept this flower, Miss Harper, in memory of a cold December morning when everything changed?" She took the rose, her eyes filling with tears. "I will, Mr. Thornton, and I will keep accepting your flowers for as long as we both shall live." They went back to the ranch, and that evening, Adelaide placed the rose in a vase on their bedroom windowsill, where she could see it when she woke in the morning. It lasted for a week before the petals began to fall, and she pressed one of them in the old Bible that had been her mother's, preserving it like she had preserved the memory of that December morning. Xander's health began to decline when he was in his late 60s. His heart had never been strong after a bout of pneumonia, and some days he tired easily. But he remained sharp, engaged with the ranch and the family, still reading voraciously, still interested in the world. Adelaide watched him carefully, noting the days when he seemed especially weary, and she treasured every moment, knowing that their time was finite. They were sitting on the porch one summer evening, watching the sun set as they had done thousands of times before, when Xander said, "Adelaide, if something happens to me, I want you to know that every day with you has been a gift, even the hard days. Even the days when we fought or worried or struggled, all of it was worth it because I got to spend it with you." "Hush," she said, her throat tight. "You are not going anywhere, I forbid it." He smiled, taking her hand. "I am not planning on it, but a man my age has to think about these things. I just want you to know that I have no regrets. My only sorrow is that I will not get to spend more time with you, because all the time in the world would not be enough." Adelaide could not speak past the lump in her throat, so she just held his hand tighter, and they watched the sun sink below the horizon together. Xander died peacefully in his sleep 3 months later, on a cool October night when the desert was just beginning to shake off the summer heat. Adelaide woke to find him still beside her, his face calm and untroubled, looking for all the world like he was just sleeping. But when she touched his hand, it was cold, and she knew he was gone. The grief was overwhelming, a tidal wave that threatened to drown her. For 42 years, Xander had been her constant companion, her partner in all things, and the world without him seemed impossible, unbearable. Thomas and Sarah moved into the main house for a while to help her through the worst of it, and all her children came home, surrounding her with love and support. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the ranch, with a simple granite headstone that read, "Xander Thornton, beloved husband, father, and friend." Adelaide planted white roses around his grave, the same roses he had bought from her all those years ago. and she tended them faithfully, visiting his grave every day. The months after his death were the hardest of Adelaide's life, harder even than the desperate days after her mother's death when she had been alone and terrified. But she was not alone now. She had her children and grandchildren. She had the ranch and the greenhouse. She had the legacy they had built together. And slowly, painfully, she learned to live with the grief, to carry it like a heavy stone that would never truly leave her but that she could learn to bear. She found comfort in her work, in the greenhouse where she had spent so many happy hours. She found comfort in her grandchildren, in teaching them about flowers and watching them grow. She found comfort in the land itself, in the desert that could be harsh and unforgiving but also achingly beautiful. On what would have been their 45th anniversary, Adelaide went to Xander's grave with a basket of white roses. She was 70 now, her body bent with age, her hair completely white, but her eyes were still bright, still the same blue-gray they had always been. She sat on a bench that Thomas had placed there for her and spoke aloud to the man she still loved with all her heart. "Hello, my darling. I brought you flowers, just like you bought flowers for me all those years ago. Do you remember? You saw me freezing on that corner and you could not ride past. You bought them all and told me to go home where it was warm. You saved me that day, Xander. And you kept saving me every day we had together. Thomas is running the ranch beautifully. You would be so proud of him, and Lily's greenhouse is thriving. She has your grandchildren working there now, learning the business. Daniel wrote from Tucson last week. He says his school has doubled in size and they are building a new classroom. And Rose visited last month with her children. They are growing so fast, Xander. You would not believe how big they are getting. I miss you. I miss you every moment of every day, but I am managing. I am living, because that is what you would want me to do. I am tending my roses and spoiling my grandchildren and watching the sunsets from our porch, and I am remembering all the good times we had. And there were so many good times, my love, so very many." She placed the roses on his grave and sat for a while longer, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, listening to the wind move through the grass. And for just a moment, she could almost feel Xander's hand in hers, could almost hear his voice telling her he loved her. Adelaide lived for 8 more years, remaining active and engaged until the very end. She saw several more grandchildren marry, held several more great-grandchildren in her arms. She continued to work in the greenhouse until she physically could not anymore, and even then she would sit among the plants, breathing in the green scent of growing things, feeling connected to her mother and to Xander through the roses they had all loved. She died on a December morning, 50 years almost to the day after Xander had bought her flowers. Thomas found her in her bed, a peaceful smile on her face, one hand stretched out as if reaching for someone. On her nightstand was the dried rose petal from their 30th anniversary, carefully preserved in her mother's Bible. They buried her next to Xander, and her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to say goodbye. The hillside was covered in white roses, hundreds of them, blooming despite the December chill. And as they lowered her into the ground, a lone rider appeared on the ridge above the ranch, sitting tall on a bay horse, watching. When Thomas looked again, the rider was gone, and he wondered if he had imagined it. But Adelaide's youngest granddaughter swore she had seen him too, a cowboy in a sheepskin coat and broad-brimmed hat, and she said he had been smiling. The ranch continued under Thomas's management and eventually passed to his children. The greenhouse remained a thriving business, run by Lily's descendants, still growing the white roses that Adelaide had loved. And in the town of Coolidge, which had grown from a dusty desert settlement into a proper city, There was a small park on the corner of First and Main, where a historical marker told the story of Adelaide Harper and Xander Thornton, and how their love story had begun on a frozen December morning in 1883. The marker did not tell the whole story, of course. It could not capture the warmth of Xander's eyes or the strength of Adelaide's hands. It could not convey the thousands of small moments that made up a marriage, the morning coffees and evening talks, the shared worries and celebrated triumphs, the way they had learned each other's rhythms and built a life together one day at a time. It could not express the depth of a love that had begun with a simple act of kindness and had endured for a lifetime and beyond. But the white roses that grew in the park, carefully tended by the city's gardeners, told their own story. They spoke of beauty rising from hardship, of love blooming in unexpected places, of the lasting legacy that two people could create when they chose to build something together. And on cold December mornings, when frost occasionally touched the Arizona desert, those roses would bloom defiantly, white and perfect against the gray sky, a reminder that even in the coldest times, warmth and love could be found. All it took was someone willing to see another person's need, to offer help without expectation of return, to say with simple kindness, "Go home, it is too cold." That moment of compassion had changed two lives and created a family that spread across generations. It had built a ranch and a business and a legacy that endured long after the original lovers were gone. And in that, there was a lesson that Adelaide and Xander's descendants carried with them, passing it down to their children and their children's children. Love could begin in an instant, in a chance meeting on a cold street corner. But it was nurtured through years of daily choices, of choosing each other again and again, of building something lasting through work and dedication, and unwavering commitment. It was not always easy, but it was always worth it, in the end. Adelaide and Xander's story was not just about a cowboy who bought flowers from a desperate girl. It was about two lonely people who found each other against all odds and chose to build a life together. It was about resilience and hope, and the transformative power of love. It was about second chances and new beginnings, and the family they created from nothing but determination and devotion. Their story lived on in the ranch that still bore the Thornton name, in the greenhouse that still grew Adelaide's roses, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their blood and their legacy. But most of all, it lived on in the memory of that December morning, when a cowboy saw a girl selling flowers in the freezing cold and decided to help, setting in motion events that would echo through generations. And every December, when the temperature dropped and the desert grew cold, the descendants of Adelaide and Xander would gather at the family cemetery on the hillside overlooking the ranch. They would place white roses on the graves of their ancestors, and they would tell the story again, making sure it was never forgotten. They would tell about Adelaide standing on the corner with her basket of flowers, about Xander riding up on his bay horse, about the moment when he bought all her flowers and told her to go home. They would tell about the courtship and the wedding, about building the ranch and raising their family, about 42 years of marriage and a love that death itself could not diminish. And the youngest children would listen with wide eyes, and they would ask if it was true, if love could really happen like that, so quickly and so completely. And their parents and grandparents would smile and say yes, it was true, every word of it. And then they would add that while love might begin in a moment, it was sustained through a lifetime of small kindnesses, of choosing each other every day, of building something together that would last beyond their own lives. That was the real magic, they would say. Not the romance of that first meeting, though that was special too, but the magic of two people who committed to each other and kept that commitment through good times and bad, through prosperity and hardship, through all the ordinary moments that made up a life. That was what Adelaide and Xander had built, and that was the legacy they had left behind. As the sun set over the ranch on those December evenings, painting the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful to be real, the family would stand together among the white roses, feeling the presence of their ancestors in the land itself. And they would know that they were part of something larger than themselves, part of a story that had begun with kindness and grown into a legacy of love. The wind would carry the sweet scent of roses across the hillside, and if they listened carefully, they might almost hear the echo of Xander's voice saying, "Go home. It is too cold," and Adelaide's response, soft and full of wonder, thanking him for the flowers, for the kindness, for the life they would build together. And in that moment, the past and present would merge, and the story would live again, as vivid and real as it had been 50, 70, 100 years before. Because some love stories never truly end. They echo through time, inspiring new generations, reminding us all that beauty can be found in the coldest places, that love can bloom in the harshest soil, that a single act of kindness can change the course of a life. Adelaide and Xander's story was one such story, a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring nature of true love. And as long as white roses grew on that hillside, as long as their descendants gathered to remember, their story would live on, a beacon of hope and love in a world that desperately needed both. The ranch stretched out below the cemetery, vast and beautiful, a testament to the life they had built together. The greenhouse gleamed in the fading light, full of roses that descended from the ones Adelaide had tended so carefully all those years ago. And in the main house, lights were coming on, welcoming the family home after their annual visit to the graves. Life continued as it always did, flowing forward like a river that could not be stopped. But the past remained, woven into the present, giving it depth and meaning. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go when they leave this world, Adelaide and Xander were together again, holding hands and watching the sun set over the land they had loved, secure in the knowledge that their love had not been in vain. They had built something lasting. They had created a family. They had loved each other with a devotion that transcended death itself. And their story, which had begun on a frozen December morning in 1883, when a cowboy bought flowers from a desperate girl, would be told for generations to come, a reminder of what was possible when two people chose love over fear, hope over despair, together over alone. That was their gift to the future, their legacy to the world, and it was more valuable than all the land they had acquired, more precious than all the wealth they had accumulated. It was proof that love endured, that kindness mattered, that a single moment of compassion could echo through eternity. And so their story ended where it began, with white roses and a cold December day, with a cowboy and a girl and a chance meeting that changed everything. It was a simple story in many ways, the kind that happened every day in towns across the West. But it was also extraordinary, because all true love stories are extraordinary, each one unique and irreplaceable and precious beyond measure. Adelaide and Xander had found each other against all odds, had built a life together that exceeded their wildest dreams, and had loved each other with a devotion that time could not erode. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the ranch or the money or the success, though those things were good too, but the love, the connection, the partnership that had sustained them through 42 years of marriage and beyond. That was what their descendants remembered and celebrated and tried to emulate in their own lives. And that was why, on cold December mornings when the desert grew frigid and inhospitable, they would think of Adelaide standing on that corner, selling flowers to survive. And they would think of Xander riding up and seeing her need and responding with immediate generosity. And they would try to live their own lives with that same compassion, that same willingness to help, that same openness to love, because that was the true lesson of Adelaide and Xander's story. Not that love was easy or that life was fair or that happy endings were guaranteed, but that when you saw someone in need, you helped them, and that when you found someone worth loving, you held on tight and never let go, and that the life you built together day by ordinary day was the real miracle, the real magic, the real happily ever after. And so, as the last light faded from the December sky and the stars began to appear overhead, the family would make their way down the hillside, leaving Adelaide and Xander to their eternal rest. But they carried the story with them, held it close to their hearts, and passed it on to the next generation, ensuring that the love that had begun on a frozen December morning would never truly die. It would live on in the roses that bloomed each spring, in the ranch that prospered under their care, in the children who bore their names and their legacy. It would live on in every act of kindness, every moment of compassion, every time someone saw another person in need and chose to help. That was Adelaide and Xander's true legacy, more enduring than stone or land or even blood. They had shown the world what love could be when it was nurtured and cherished and protected. They had proved that happiness was possible even after loss, that new beginnings could follow endings, that two broken people could come together and create something whole. And their story, simple as it was, would inspire others for generations to come, a testament to the enduring power of love and the transformative nature of kindness. That December evening, as the Thornton family gathered in the main house for dinner, someone would inevitably raise a glass and propose a toast to Adelaide and Xander, to the love they had shared and the legacy they had left behind. And everyone would raise their glasses in turn, remembering and honoring the two people who had started it all. To Adelaide and Xander, they would say, "May we love as truly as they did, live as fully as they did, and leave behind a legacy as lasting as theirs. May their story never be forgotten, and may we always remember that love begins with kindness, grows through dedication, and endures beyond death itself." And the glasses would clink together, and someone would wipe away a tear, and the family would sit down to dinner, surrounded by the warmth and love that Adelaide and Xander had spent their lives creating. Outside, the desert night would settle over the land, cold and clear and infinite, and the white roses on the hillside would sway gently in the wind, keeping watch over the graves of two people who had loved each other more than life itself. Their story was complete, a perfect circle from beginning to end. And yet it continued, living on in the hearts and lives of everyone they had touched, everyone they had created, everyone who had been blessed to know them or to hear their story. That was the final magic, the ultimate gift. Love that did not end with death, but transformed into something eternal, something that could never be taken away. Adelaide and Xander Thornton had found each other on a cold December day in 1883, and they had loved each other until death parted them 50 years later. But their love had not died. It had simply changed form, becoming part of the land, part of the family, part of the story that would be told and retold for as long as there were people to tell it. And that, in the end, was the greatest testament to their love. It had endured. It had mattered. It had made a difference. And it would continue to do so, forever and always, as constant as the desert sun, as beautiful as the white roses that bloomed each spring, as timeless as love itself.